Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Rulings and Resources. In the first episode, we talked about why you should play D&D, so naturally this episode is about the first step in getting involved, which is making the character. So for this video, we're going to be creating a pretty complex character from a high-level view, and this is just to give you a rough idea of the character creation process and just how crazy you can go. So consider this video to be more concept, and the next video we do will be more about the process for a basic 5th edition character. Now, there are a lot of ways to make a character. The most balanced way, and the way I do it, is through a point-buy system that is outlined at the start of the player's handbook, and I'll go into this in more detail later on. You can find a link to the free player's handbook rules provided by Wizards in the description below. I want to briefly touch on the other ways that I've done character creation in the past, but know that, in my opinion, point-buy is just the best way for new players and for those who want a more serious, balanced campaign. Perhaps the most common way is to just roll for your stats. Typically, you'll roll 4 6-sided dice, discard the lowest roll, and add the remaining 3. This number is to be written down and used as one of your 6 stats later on after you repeat this process 5 more times. This is often just called the 4d6 method, but you can simply roll only 3 dice and discard none of them. You can also roll your stats in order so that the first total you get is always your strength score, the second is always your dexterity, etc. In other campaigns, we've even rolled just a total random race and class and then build characters, or just made everything random. Really, there are just limitless ways to make your character. So the first real step in creating a character is knowing the world in which you'll be playing, and this is something that your DM should be able to provide a little bit of guidance on. For example, is the world high magic or low magic? Is there even magic? Is there a certain time period that they're trying to go for? What races are allowed? Will any races be frowned upon in the way that a half-orc character in my campaign would just have a really rough day? Few things are worse than coming up with a great character only to find that it just doesn't fit nicely in the world, and it can cause pain points later on for you and the DM. Before getting too devoted to a single character idea, I usually recommend bouncing the idea off your DM first, and that way they can help you flesh out the backstory a little bit as well. Just for the sake of consistency, we'll pretend to be making a character for my campaign setting, which I describe as fairly low magic, a lot of religious overtones, and it's a typical medieval fantasy setting, with a bit of a lean away from some of the beast races. So once you have a rough idea of the framework you're working in, and sometimes that step comes after this one, you want to get a rough idea for the character you want to have in your head. Feel free to pull from existing characters, regardless of where they come from. I think that the first most time players will look at classics like Lord of the Rings and try to emulate their favorite character. Go for it. That is exactly what I did the first time I started. As you grow more experienced, feel free to find ways for characters outside the typical medieval fantasy mold to fit into the world of D&D. To give you an idea, I have one character that is based off Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, which isn't a huge leap to the world of D&D, but it's a little bit more intricate than your typical pre-made. At this point, it's also good to consider what kind of player you are. Are you here to create a deep, unique character, or do you want to min-max the stats to just be a combat death machine? Or maybe just a little of both. You certainly can create a combat powerhouse and make the character deep, and usually those are the more original designs. And with this example, I'm not going to set any expectations for combat effectiveness. I'm just going to go true to the character. I'm also going to be making it a bit more difficult by remaking a character in D&D from a post-apocalyptic version of the modern world. So in this episode, I'm going to be making Joel from The Last of Us to work in D&D. For those unfamiliar with Joel or The Last of Us in general, it's a great game and I highly recommend it. The story alone could be a fantastic movie. While I give a brief overview of Joel and kind of the character design that we're going for, I'll be playing some clips in the background, avoiding major spoilers, just to give you an idea of who Joel is and what he does. Now, when creating a character either from a recreation like this or just from scratch, one of the first things I try to consider is combat. Just how does he fight? Swords, bows, hand-to-hand, magic. In the case of Joel, he's a little of the first 3, and that means we're going to have to make some sacrifices in combat effectiveness just to make him a more well-rounded fighter that he actually is. But for this build, I want to focus on physical strength. Joel has a lot of moments in the story where he physically overpowers others, and near the beginning of the game, we see that he isn't perhaps the most agile of people. We don't see as many scenes where Joel is a sharpshooter either, so instead he's grappling with people and just kicking ass with lead pipes. After offense, I look at defense. Now, being the setting that they're in, Joel just wears clothes like everyone else that isn't military. So we'll kind of put this one on the back burner for now, and think of it as filler, especially for this character. There are some characters where defense is just a primary aspect. Maybe you're trying to make Braum from League of Legends, for example, where you just have very little offense and are purely just there to defend others. So with the combat aspect aside, let us look at what makes the character unique. In Joel, a few things stand out to me. His ability to survive in the wilderness, his somewhat smuggler past, his ability to craft things, and just his overall charisma, often through intimidation, which further drives home my preference for a physical strength build. So this is where knowledge of the available classes in D&D comes into play, and if this is your first time, you want to read through the player's handbook to get a rough idea of those classes and see which might fit the criteria that you've set. But if you have any experience with fantasy role-playing games in general, you might be able to assume a few generalizations about them. So, starting with the ability to survive in the wilderness, the obvious match here is Ranger. They are literally built to do just that. You could really only argue Druid or Rogue, but the Druid is more spiritual than I'd like for Joel, and while a Rogue is a great survivor in an urban environment, Joel thrives outside of cities. Next, we'll look at the Smuggler Past. We're really driving the idea of a Rogue back to the forefront with this one. There's really not many other things to consider. That is literally what rogues do, and he mostly did that while in an urban environment. So at this point, I'm equally drawn to Ranger and Rogue. Next was his ability to craft things, just a kind of a minor game mechanic, and it's not really focused on any particular class. If anything, this may come down to the tools provided by your chosen background, so for the time being, we'll also put this on the back burner. Last, I mentioned his charisma and intimidation. And again, this is something that really any character can have an affinity for, so we'll just put this on the back burner as well. So, just to recap our idea of Joel so far, we want a character that is primarily physically strong, but has some skill with ranged weapons. He's able to survive and thrive both inside and outside of city walls, sometimes through less than legal means, and we know he is charismatic with a bit of a crafting skill. To really maximize Joel's potential, we're going to take advantage of 2 Unearthed Arcana articles, the Ranger Revised and the Ranger and Rogue articles. I'll include links to both of those in the description. Remember that when using anything to create your character that is outside of just the regular player's handbook, you always want to consult with your DM. For me personally, if it's officially from Wizards and falls within the world that I have planned, I'll allow it. We're also going to be going pretty deep here with multiclassing, which isn't something I recommend for new players at all, but for this example, and making such a complex character, it's going to be required. After you've made a few basic characters, multiclassing is really a great way to create a very deep and unique character. In older editions like 3.5, Wizards of the Coast create a stat blocks for a lot of NPCs, like the Deities and Drist, a famous character in the R.A. Salvatore novels, who is a combination of Rogue, Ranger, and Barbarian, even though he's commonly just portrayed as just a pure Ranger. So the first thing we're going to start with is just the character's race, and for Joel, we're going to go human for 2 reasons. The first is just staying true to the character, and the second is I find that the variant human, with the option of starting with a feat at first level, is just a very good option for unique characters. But we'll go into more depth about that feat choice later. At that point, depending on the chosen feat, you're getting the same +3 stats offered by most other races, in addition to some extra goodies provided by the feat. Now, when it comes to making a more standard character, race is actually one of the last things I consider. Very often I might look and say, okay, my class and build relies heavily on this stat, which race gives me the +2 to that stat? But that is by no means the best or only way to pick a race. It makes sense to put a +2 to your best stat, but you could also just buy that stat up and use a +2 to a lesser stat to create a more rounded character. Always consider what you think would be fun to play. For me personally, I typically choose races that are similar to me in real life, tall and thin. So, elves, basically. I play a lot of elves. The second thing to choose is a class, and for Joel, we're going to multi-class not 2, but 3 classes. I went back and forth on which class to start with, and even though I earlier said I was liking Ranger or Rogue for Joel, we're actually going to start off with him as a first level fighter. And this choice is for a few reasons. Even though the time spent at first level is brief, the second wind ability for a fighter to regain 2 to 11 HP at level 1 is just an amazing safety net. Also, the starting equipment for fighter will actually max out a lot of the armor class and damage levels we're going to be looking at for Joel. When it comes to choosing a class to play for a standard 5th edition character, where you are not multi-classing, this is really the most important step, finding the class that you want to play. Now, many of the classes are pretty straightforward. Anyone that is a fan of fantasy games can give you a rough idea of what the differences are between a wizard, a rogue, and a barbarian. But what about the differences between a wizard, a sorcerer, and a warlock? Or the differences between a barbarian or a fighter? I truly just recommend reading the overview of each class provided in the player's handbook, get an idea for the overall theme of the class as a whole, and then dive into the ones that seem relevant to the idea you have in your head. Very often, some of the classes might overlap, like Ranger and Rogue, and you may find yourself trying to choose the best one, and that is really where the archetypes and just reading the class in full is going to help figure out which one is going to be most relevant to the character you have in your head. In the next video, we'll go deeper into this, but for now, we'll just leave it at that. Once you have a race and class in mind, I start building the stats. Now, as I said, I almost always recommend doing a 27 point buy, as illustrated in the player's handbook. And there are a few great calculators online that make this somewhat complicated process much easier. I'll include a link in the description to my favorite one. For Joel, I'm taking pretty well-rounded stats with the point buy coming to a strength of 14, which gives us a +2 modifier, a dexterity of 13 for a +1 modifier, a constitution of 12 for a +1 modifier, an intelligence of 10 for a 0 modifier, a wisdom of 13 for a +1 modifier, and a charisma of 12 for a +1 modifier. Now, for the human variant, I get to add +1 to 2 stats of my choosing, and for this I'm taking strength and dexterity, increasing them to 15 and 14 respectively, and that's going to increase the dexterity modifier to +2. I also get to choose a feat, and for this one I'm taking athlete, which will allow me to increase Joel's strength score by +1 again to 16, and that will bump me up to a +3 modifier that I'm looking for. The only crucial piece of advice I give when it comes to doing a point buy is always put your primary damage dealing ability to a 14 or 15, since 15 is the max for the point buy rules, and use something like your racial or a feat to boost it to at least a 16 at level 1 and get the +3 modifier. This isn't required, but you'll find that the extra +1 to your attack and damage rolls, especially at level 1 where most of the enemies have single digit hit points, is just very useful. For most classes, this is either strength or dexterity, but obviously for spellcasters like wizards or warlocks, this is going to be intelligence, wisdom, or charisma. The last thing to choose is your character's background. Now, each DM may handle these differently, but when I think of a background, I'm really just thinking of the feature that it gives you and the skill proficiencies. When you choose your background, or when your DM helps you to create one, I usually recommend doing it around the time that you're looking at the skill proficiencies offered by your class, so you're not overlapping. For simplicity's sake, I chose the Outlander for Joel. Athletics and survival are just perfect skills for this character, and the fact that he can find food and water for his party also just makes sense. So now that we have a framework for Joel, we're going to go ahead and start choosing his options from the fighter class in terms of starting equipment and skill proficiencies. To mention it briefly, I always just recommend going through the choices in your class and never rolling your starting gold or buying all your gear from scratch. You can if you want to, but this is just the fastest, easiest way. For all you DMs out there, I highly recommend doing what I do and just allow your characters to cash out things that they don't need. For example, if a character chooses options that give them both a longbow and a crossbow, let them exchange one for the gold value in the handbook so they can buy something else, like some daggers or a healing potion. For Joel, the decision to go fighter was partially due to these starting options. Since we're already proficient in athletics and survival, we're going to take perception and intimidation from the list provided. The human variant also gives us an extra skill proficiency of our choosing, and I'm going to take stealth for that one. For starting equipment, we have the choice between chainmail or leather armor that includes a longbow and 20 arrows. We're going to opt for chainmail because it gives the highest starting armor class, which does not impose disadvantage on stealth rolls. The only better AC is the breastplate, and that just isn't a starting option, and it only gives us an additional +1 to the armor class. This, with the +2 dexterity modifier cap, which we hit, gives us a starting AC of 15, which is just ideal. Don't forget that with your starting hit points, we'll be starting with 11 due to our +1 constitution and the fighter's D10 hit dice. The next option on the fighter list is between a martial weapon and a shield, or 2 martial weapons. Since I don't see Joel dual-wielding weapons, we're going to opt for the first option. For our martial weapon, we'll take a rapier, for reasons that'll be apparent later. The shield will give us an additional +2 to our AC, which will take it up to 17, which is going to put you on par with most tanks like paladins or clerics. This character is definitely meant at level 1 to be right up in the enemy's face. Next choice is between a light crossbow or 2 hand axes. Now, with hand axes being a thrown weapon, you can choose either your strength or dexterity modifier for attack and damage rolls, meaning since he's strength based, we're going to be going with a +5 after your proficiency modifier to hit, and doing 1d6 plus 3 points of damage, giving you a range of 4 to 9. With the crossbow, you'll be forced to use your dexterity, meaning you're only looking at a +4 to hit, and doing 1d8 plus 2 points of damage for a 3 to 10 range. Honestly, the hand axes are probably the better combat choice here. It's pretty close, but we're going to go with the crossbow just for flavor. As for the pack, this is totally up to you. Both options for the fighter offer torches, which, for a human without dark vision, you're going to need those. Now, let us take a look at the class features from here to level 20 to complete our character for Joel. We'll do this quickly, as some of this is just going to be very, very high level. At this point, it is important to note that your character is basically done and ready to play. All that is left is for you to flesh out their personality, their language options, alignment, stuff like that. So far, between Human and Outlander, we're at Common with 2 additional languages. At level 2, we'll pick up a 3rd, you'll see why. And I always just recommend discussing with your DM what languages they think are going to make sense for you to know, or just be otherwise useful. So, for level 1, I already covered the fighter's second wind ability, but I didn't cover the fighting style that they get as well. So for this build, the fighting style of dueling is going to be a nice choice for the extra damage, defense is going to be a good choice for more AC, and at that point you'll be rivaling most dedicated tanks. And protection is just a great support ability. Given how much of The Last of Us revolves around Joel protecting Ellie, I would take protection, and I think even if this wasn't Joel and just a regular character, I'd take protection anyways. You don't often get to use your reaction in the first level, and giving an enemy disadvantage could save one of your squishier allies like a wizard from certain death if they got attacked. Your damage is already good, and your AC is already much higher than most. For the second level, we're going to take the Ranger as it is outlined in the Unearthed Arcana article, linked in the description below. This is going to give us another D10 for HP, which is very important at second level still. We'll also get the Favorite Enemy ability, which gives us +2 to damage rolls against that enemy type, as well as advantage on survival checks to track them, and an additional language, like I mentioned earlier. So for Joel, the obvious choice here is Undead. We're also going to get a Natural Explorer, which is a fantastic ability. There is a lot here with the Natural Explorer ability, but the big things I want to focus on are the fact that we have advantage on all our initiative rolls, and whenever we attack someone who hasn't acted yet in combat, we have advantage on that attack. This means you should almost always be at the top of order in combat, and you should almost always hit your first attack. So for third level, we're just rounding it off and taking a first level in Rogue, hitting all 3 of the classes that we're going to be using for Joel. This is going to give us the Expertise ability, which will double 2 of our skill proficiencies, always nice. It gives us Thieves' Cant, which is just essentially going to be a 5th language to speak, which doesn't hurt. The most important thing, though, that we get is the sneak attack damage of an additional 1d6 when hitting a target with advantage. The note on this ability is also that it only goes when using a finesse or ranged weapon, which is why I chose the Rapier at level 1 earlier. This means that at level 3 with our Rapier, we'll have advantage on all our initiative rolls, which should guarantee advantage on someone thanks to the Natural Explorer. And because of that advantage, we can be doing 1d8 plus 1d6 plus 3 damage with our Rapier for a range of 5 to 17 damage. If the enemy is undead, like a skeleton or a zombie, that would be 7 to 19 damage. To compare, a Rogue at 3rd level that took the Assassin archetype with similar stats and a Rapier would be doing 1d8 plus 2d6 plus 3 damage for a range of 6 to 23. But no advantage on initiative, so there's no guarantee that they're going to be able to go before anyone and get that advantage ability. And that's not even to talk about the other advantages you get for Natural Explorer. From this point, we'll be taking levels in Rogue from here on out to a point. We'll be taking the Scout archetype outlined in one of the Unearthed Arcana articles, which I'll link to in the description. I'm not going to go into great detail, you can read it all for yourself, but between things like Cunning Action from Rogue, Skirmisher from the Scout archetype, and Superior Mobility, this is going to make Joel a very mobile character in combat. We're looking at making a very slippery, highly mobile, frontline fighter that is also doing some pretty nice damage. And that's to say nothing of how useful you are going to be outside of combat, providing food and water for your allies during travel, being able to track enemies, especially undead ones, and you will also just have very strong skills. Though you may not be proficient in many, we're making great use of what you have. Now, as you level up, when it comes to taking ability score improvements, I usually recommend grabbing feats if your DM is going to allow that optional rule. For Joel here, the feats of Durable, Tavern Brawler, Tough, and Alert would all be great options, but always just kind of mix it up and choose what's going to help your playstyle and your party. Now at character level 15, you're going to have a choice. You can take either your 14th level in Rogue and get Blind Sense, and that's it. At that point, I recommend taking levels 17 through 20 as a fighter again, taking the Champion archetype and giving you the extra attack feature for a 5th level fighter when your character reaches level 20. Now if you don't think Blind Sense is worth a whole level, take your 2nd level in fighter as your 16th character level and stick with that. You'll hit level 6 fighter instead, get an extra ability score improvement instead of Blind Sense. Also, at any time, mix those extra levels of fighter in to get the Action Surge ability and the Champion archetype if you would prefer to have those and delay some of the Rogue benefits. I might actually recommend going to 9th level Rogue, taking 2 levels in fighter to get Champion, and then resume your Rogue levels before ending with 2 to 3 more levels of fighter, depending on that earlier choice of if you like Blind Sense or not. For the Champion maneuvers, by the way, I'd recommend Disarming Attack, Feigning Attack, and Tripping Attack, but feel free to choose those that best suit your style. Well everyone, I know this is a really high level of a character creation process, but I hope that you enjoyed it and this is giving you an idea of just how unique of a character you can make. In the next video of Rulings and Resources, we're going to take a deeper dive into just first level creation, where we talk about the individual stats and what they do, take a closer look at the available races and classes, and we'll just go step by step in designing a more typical first level character. So if you like this video, hit the like button. If you're new to our channel, hit the subscribe button. If you have an idea for a character you'd like me to recreate similar to this, leave your suggestions in the comments below. And as a friendly reminder, be sure to tune in every Sunday for the latest episode of our 5th edition campaign, Crit Happens, either here or on iTunes.